Alright then, so in the last video we hooked up the functionality of this form to the component so that when we start to enter details into these different form fields or select an author right here, it updates the state of the component. Then when we click on the add button, it logs the state of the component to the console so we can see the author ID that we've selected, the genre and the name that we've entered into these two fields. Now that's cool. We're taking a step forward, but we're not really doing anything with that data yet. And ideally, we'd like to make a mutation on the GraphQL server to add this book to the database. So let's look at how we can start doing that. The first step is to actually make this mutation, this query. So let's go to the queries.js and add it in right here. So we'll store this in a const and call it add book mutation, since we're adding a book, right? And set that equal to GQL, much like we did with these other queries that we've composed or created. And then we'll do our template string. Then inside, we want to open up our curly braces. But because this is a mutation, remember, we have to add the keyword mutation before the first curly brace here. All right. So what is the mutation we want to make? Well, if we remember back to our server-side code over here, let's go into the schema and we'll take a look at the mutations that we have down here. And one of them was add author, one of them was add book. So this is the name of the mutation we want to create, and it's expecting these three arguments: the name, the genre, and the author ID. And they are the three things on this form: the name, the genre, and the author ID. So let's make this mutation now and pass in those three parameters. So it's called add book, and we're taking three parameters. The first one is the name parameter, and we don't know that just yet, so we'll enter an empty string. The next is the genre, and again, we don't know what that's going to be yet, so let's just put an empty string. And again, the same we're going to do for author ID, just an empty string to begin with. And we'll look at how we can dynamically populate these later, depending on what the user's entered into the form. But for now, empty strings are fine. So we're going to make this mutation, which is going to add a book, right? And if we call this right now, it's just going to add the book with these three properties all being empty strings. Now, that's fine for now. When we make the mutation, we can request some data back, and I'm going to choose the name, right? And I'm also going to choose to get the ID of that book back. So that is our mutation. Let's export it right here. So add book mutation. And then what we need to do is import this mutation into the add book component right here, which is where we're going to use it when we enter or submit the form. So from this same file, we can just do a comma and say add book mutation, which is there. And now we can use it inside here. So then, now we have two mutations, or rather one mutation and one query inside this component that we want to use. Now, down here, all we're doing is we're binding that one query, but we've got two essentially now that we want to bind to the component. So how do we do that? How can we combine, or rather bind, both of these different queries to the component? Well, there's a couple of different ways we can do this. The way I'm going to show you is by using the compose method. Now, we have to import that at the top here from React Apollo. So I'm going to do a comma next to this and import compose right there. So we can use this compose function at the bottom here where we're binding the queries to the component. And the reason we need this is because we can't just do something like this. We can't just add in another set of parentheses and say, okay, well, also I want to do the add book mutation and bind that as well. This doesn't work. We need to compose the two queries together, right? When we're exporting this component. So let's instead get rid of this and get rid of GraphQL. And we're going to export default compose, which is the thing we just imported. And then in parenthesis, we're going to do something. We're going to compose our queries. We're going to keep add book at the end. We're still attaching whatever queries we add in here to the add book component. So that stays there. But now we can list out the different queries and mutations that we want to compose together for this component, right? So again, we use GraphQL, much like we did before. and we say we want to bind the get authors query first of all, right? That's the one we initially had bound to this thing right here. And we're going to give this a name property. This is going to become clear as to why we give this a name property in a few minutes when I walk you through how we attach these queries up here. But the name is going to be the same thing as the actual variable here, get authors query. Doesn't have to be, but that's what I'm calling it. Okay, the next query or mutation I want to compose here is the add book mutation. So I'll say GraphQL again and add book mutation. And again, we give this an options object right here, and the name property is going to be this time add book mutation, like so. All right. So now we have these two different mutations, or rather this mutation and this query composed together, and they're both now bound to this component, right? So that's how we can bind several different queries and mutations together to one component, because sometimes you do need to bind multiple queries to one component. It's not always one query, all right? So then, first of all, how does this affect what's currently going on here? Well, let's just give this a whirl in the browser and see what's happening. Right then, so we get an error, and the error's basically round here, if data.loading. So let's just take a look at what's going on here. So it says cannot read property loading of undefined, right? So at the minute, it's saying that this data is undefined. Right here, we're setting data equal to this.props.data, and then it's saying cannot read loading of undefined. So it's saying this here is undefined, right? So instead, let's console.log this.props, right? And let's see what happens here. What's happening to the props now? Now we have two different queries, or a query and a mutation attached or bound to this component. Let's see how it's attaching those to the props object. So let's save it and rerun this in a browser, and we can see if we scroll right to the top before the errors, we can see this thing here, and we have two properties on here now. We have the add book mutation, and we also have the get authors query. And if we look inside the get authors query, these are all the same properties as we had before on the data object. But since we're making two different queries, or a query and a mutation now, we don't just get that data property, we get the names of these two different queries, right? So the add book mutation is going to get the different properties for this query, and the get authors query property is going to have the different properties of this query right here. So instead of saying .data, we can say .get authors query. So let us go over here and say the data is equal to this.props.get authors query, like so. Okay, so this here is just replacing the data, the name of that property that this stuff is attached to, this particular query. And the reason it has this name is because we named it like that down here when we gave this a name property, right? So let us save that and see if this works now. We'll go to the browser, and you can see now they're displayed on the screen. And we have this get authors query right here, which is showing all the authors now, right? So we have Patrick Rothfuss, Sanderson, and Terry Pratchett. Everything's working now. Cool. So now we know how to compose queries together and how to access the data from those queries separately. But how do we actually make this mutation, right? Because at the minute, if I do this, book name, I don't know, test, and then the genre is fantasy. And by the way, this is updating because we're console logging the prop every time the component re-renders, okay? So we'll change that in a minute, but select author, Patrick Rothfuss. If I do this now, then we're still logging out this state right here, but we're not actually making that mutation, right? We're adding, or we're binding that mutation to the component, but we're not really doing anything with it. All we're doing is logging the state still to the console. So how do we now access this mutation and make it from the React component? Well, pretty simply. So here, where we're currently logging this this.state to the console, we'll get rid of that. I also want to get rid of this console.log as well. And instead what we're going to do is call that mutation when we click on that add button, and we call this submit form function, right? So we do that by saying this dot props dot add book mutation, just like that. So just like we said, this dot props dot get author query to get the data from that get authors query. To use the add book mutation, we say this dot props dot add book mutation, right? And again, the reason it's this name is because we gave it that name at the bottom here, add book mutation. So whatever we call it there, we can call it right here when we invoke that function. So what's going to happen here? Well, this is going to add a book, but it's going to add that book and it's not going to have any values, because in our queries, when we call the mutation, we're not actually passing any values through here. Yes, they're on the state right here, okay? They're being stored in the state of this component, but we're not passing what is on the state, these different properties, into the mutation when we call it. So let's just try this out. Open it up in a browser and refresh. Now let's add a book name. So we'll say Hogfather. Now this is fantasy and it's by Terry Pratchett, right? So let's press plus now. And okay, nothing seems to happen. But if we now go to MLab and have a look at our collection of books, we should see something has been added. So if we go to the bottom, there's a new record here, but it has a name of nothing, a genre of nothing, and an author ID of an empty string as well. All empty strings right there. So like I said, that's because when we make this query, we're calling it right here, right? And it's looking at this query and it's making that mutation. But when we make the mutation, it's only passing these through as those variables. So now we need to find a way to dynamically pass through the variables that are being stored here, the state, into this mutation, so that when we add a new book, it's the correct values that are passed along into that record.